November 7, 1944. The transport truck rattled to a stop outside Camp Wheeler, Massachusetts, and 23 German women climbed down into the cold American afternoon. Liesl Hoffman was among them, her gray auxiliary uniform still bearing the insignia she had worn as a nurse in the Wehrmacht Medical Corps. At 22 years old, she had expected many things from American captivity. Brutality, perhaps, starvation, certainly, humiliation, without question. What she had not expected was the smell of roasted chicken drifting across the compound as the guards led them toward the processing building. Greta Fischer, a radio operator from Munich, who stood beside Liesl in line, whispered harshly in German, "They're trying to trick us. Making us smell food we'll never taste." At 26, Greta had seen enough of the war to trust nothing, especially kindness from enemies. Her sharp eyes surveyed the camp with suspicious calculation, looking for the cruelty she knew must be hiding beneath this strange welcome. Young Anneliese Braun, barely 19, and still looking like a schoolgirl despite her uniform, clutched her small canvas bag tighter. "I haven't smelled real meat in 2 years," she murmured, her voice carrying the hollow echo of prolonged hunger that every German citizen had learned to live with. The other women nodded silently. They all remembered when meat was something that appeared on tables, not just in increasingly distant memories. Frieda Schneider, at 31, the oldest among this particular group, placed a protective hand on Anneliese's shoulder. As a former supply officer, Frieda had spent the last 3 years of the war watching rations shrink and quality deteriorate. She had distributed sawdust bread and watery soup to soldiers who were little more than boys. She knew what real deprivation looked like, and the irony of smelling abundance in an enemy prison camp was not lost on her. Captain Helen Morrison stood waiting for them inside the processing building, her American uniform crisp and her expression professionally neutral. She had been a school principal before the war, and she carried that same mixture of authority and underlying compassion into her military role. "You will be processed, assigned barracks, and given medical examinations," she announced in clear English. A translator repeated her words in German, though several of the women understood enough to follow along. "Then you will be taken to the mess hall for your evening meal." The word meal hung in the air like an impossible promise. Liesl caught the eye of another prisoner, an older woman named Elsa Zimmermann, whose bitter expression suggested she believed nothing good could come from their captors. Elsa's silent judgment seemed to say what they were all thinking. This must be a cruel joke, some elaborate American trick to break their spirits before the real deprivations began. But when the processing finished 2 hours later, and the guards led them across the compound, the smell of chicken had only grown stronger. And there, through the mess hall windows, Liesl could see steam rising from enormous pots, could see American soldiers carrying trays laden with what looked like actual food. Liesl had not seen food like this since 1941. She stood frozen in the mess hall doorway, staring at the serving line where American kitchen staff ladled thick stew onto metal trays. Beside her, the other German women had gone equally still, their eyes wide with disbelief. This was not the meager prison ration they had prepared themselves to accept. This was more food than most of them had seen on a single plate in 3 years. Sergeant James Patterson stood behind the serving counter, a tall man with kind eyes and the slight drawl of Georgia in his voice. His father had owned a restaurant in Atlanta before the Depression, and Jim had grown up believing that feeding people was one of the most fundamental acts of human decency. He had volunteered for kitchen duty in the Army because he could not bear the thought of anyone, even enemies, going hungry on his watch. "Y'all just grab a tray and come on through," he said gently, gesturing to the stack of metal trays at the line's beginning. Private Robert Chen stood beside him, his own family history making him acutely aware of what it felt like to be seen as foreign, as other. His parents had immigrated from China and built a small grocery in San Francisco, where young Robert had learned that food could bridge gaps that language could not. He watched the German women's faces and recognized the expression he had seen in mirrors during his own childhood when white customers looked at his family with suspicion. These women expected cruelty, and that expectation broke something inside him. Frieda was the first to move forward. As a supply officer, she had learned to assess situations quickly and act decisively. She picked up a tray with hands that trembled slightly, then moved down the line. Sergeant Patterson ladled chicken and dumplings onto her plate, the portions generous by any standard, obscene by wartime German standards. Then came green beans, real butter, a thick slice of bread that was actually white, not the gray mockery of bread that Germany had been producing. Frieda's throat tightened, but she kept her face carefully neutral. One by one, the other women followed. Liesl found herself standing before Sergeant Patterson, her tray extended. He smiled at her, not with mockery or superiority, but with simple human warmth. "This here's my grandmother's recipe," he said, though she did not understand his words. She always said chicken and dumplings could fix just about any bad day. He filled her plate until it seemed impossible that the tray could hold more, then added an extra dumpling with a conspiratorial wink. Liesl carried her tray to one of the long tables, her mind struggling to reconcile what she held with everything she had been told about Americans. In Germany, they had been taught that the Allies were cruel, that they starved their prisoners, that surrender meant death, or worse. Yet here she sat, holding more food than her family in Berlin had probably seen in a month. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful. Anneliese sat beside her, tears streaming silently down her young face as she stared at her plate. The mess hall had fallen into an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of forks against metal trays. 23 German women sat in careful formation, eating slowly, almost reverently, as if the food might vanish if they moved too quickly. Liesl brought the first forkful of chicken and dumplings to her mouth, and nearly wept at the taste. It was not just that the food was hot and plentiful. It was that it had been prepared with care, seasoned with actual spices, cooked until the meat fell tender from the bone. This was not prison food. This was someone's grandmother's recipe, offered to enemies as if they were guests. Greta Fischer ate mechanically, her face a mask of controlled emotion. She refused to show gratitude, refused to acknowledge the kindness being offered. To accept this generosity felt like betrayal somehow, like admitting that everything they had been told about their enemies was a lie. She had built her identity around serving the Reich, around believing in the rightness of their cause. A plate of chicken and dumplings should not have the power to crack that foundation, yet she felt it shifting beneath her nonetheless. Across the hall, Elsa Zimmermann pushed her food around her plate with visible disdain, though Liesl noticed she had cleaned half of it already. "They fatten us up like livestock," Elsa muttered in German, her voice carrying to nearby tables. "There is always a reason when the enemy shows mercy, always a price to be paid later." Several of the younger women glanced nervously at their plates, Elsa's bitterness casting shadows over their unexpected meal. But Frida would not let cynicism poison this moment. "Or perhaps," she said quietly in German, her voice carrying the authority of age and experience, "perhaps they feed us because they are not the monsters we were told they were. Perhaps we were the ones who were lied to." The words hung heavy in the air. It was a dangerous thought, one that opened doors better left closed. If the Americans were not monsters, then who were the real villains in this war? Sergeant Patterson moved through the hall with a coffee pot, refilling cups without being asked. He paused at their table, offering refills with that same easy smile. "Y'all need anything else? We got pie if anyone's got room." He mimed eating and pointed toward the kitchen, trying to communicate across the language barrier. Private Chen followed with a tray of apple pie slices, setting them on the table with careful deliberation. Anneliese stared at the pie as if it were a hallucination. Apples, sugar, crust made with real butter. She looked up at Private Chen, her 19-year-old face showing every emotion she could not put into words. "Danke," she whispered, the German word of thanks escaping before she could stop it. Chen smiled and nodded, understanding crossing the boundary that language could not. That night in their assigned barracks, the women lay in cots that had actual mattresses, under blankets that provided real warmth. Liesl stared at the ceiling, her stomach full for the first time in years, her mind churning with questions that had no easy answers. 3 weeks into their captivity, Sergeant Patterson faced an unexpected problem. His kitchen staff had been reduced by half due to a flu outbreak, and he had 40 mouths to feed with only 2 able-bodied helpers. He stood in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, staring at mountains of potatoes that needed peeling and vegetables that needed chopping, calculating whether he could possibly prepare breakfast on time. The solution, when it came, was unconventional but necessary. He sought out Captain Morrison with a request that raised her eyebrows, but ultimately earned her approval. By 6 o'clock that morning, Frida Schneider stood in the American military kitchen, wearing an apron over her gray uniform, a peeling knife in her experienced hands. She had volunteered immediately when the request was translated, seeing an opportunity to be useful, to contribute something beyond passive acceptance of their captivity. Beside her stood Liesl and 3 other women, who had raised their hands when asked who had cooking experience. The kitchen became a strange space where former enemies worked side by side, communicating through gestures, demonstrations, and the universal language of food preparation. Sergeant Patterson showed Liesl how to make American-style biscuits, his hands demonstrating the folding technique that created those flaky layers. She watched intently, her nurse's training making her naturally observant of precise procedures. In return, she tried to explain through pantomime how her mother had made Kartoffelpuffer, German potato pancakes, before the war had taken everything, including simple pleasures like eggs and oil. Patterson watched with genuine interest, sketching notes on a pad of paper, trying to capture the technique even without her words. Private Chen worked alongside Greta, who had initially refused to volunteer, but had been persuaded by Frida's pointed reminder that idle hands made captivity feel longer. Chen showed her how Americans cut vegetables, the particular angle of the knife, the rocking motion that made the work efficient. Greta found herself grudgingly impressed by the quality of the produce they were preparing. Real carrots, not the woody, half-rotten specimens that had filled German markets. Fresh onions that made her eyes water with their pungency, not the dried, bitter ones that had been all anyone could find in Munich. The women worked, in concentrated silence at first, but gradually, sounds began to fill the kitchen. Chen hummed while he worked, an old Chinese melody his mother had sung. Liesl found herself humming in response, a German folk song from her childhood. Patterson began teaching them English words for what they were preparing. Flour, he would say, pointing, milk, butter, salt. The women repeated the words carefully, their German accents making the syllables sound foreign and new. By the third day of their kitchen duty, something remarkable had happened. The work had created a rhythm, a sense of shared purpose that transcended the prisoner-captor relationship. When Annalise accidentally burned a pan of biscuits, Patterson simply laughed and showed her how to adjust the oven temperature. No punishment, no anger, just patient instruction. When Chen struggled to understand Frida's attempt to explain a German cooking technique, Liesl stepped in as translator, her English improving daily through necessity and immersion. The meals they prepared together fed both groups, German prisoners and American soldiers sitting in the same mess hall, eating food that hands from both nations had touched. December 24, 1944. Christmas Eve arrived at Camp Wheeler with fresh snow covering the Massachusetts landscape and a silence that felt heavier than usual. Liesl woke in her barracks to the sound of Annalise crying softly in the cot beside her. The youngest among them had been holding herself together with remarkable strength, but holidays had a way of breaking down carefully constructed walls. "I keep thinking about my mother," Annalise whispered in German. "She always made Stollen on Christmas Eve. I wonder if she even has flour this year. I wonder if she's alive." The question hung in the cold morning air, unanswerable and terrible. None of them had received letters from home. None of them knew what was happening in the cities they had left behind. The last news from Germany spoke of increasing Allied bombing campaigns, of infrastructure collapsing, of civilian casualties mounting. Every woman in the barracks carried the same gnawing uncertainty about whether anyone they loved had survived to see another Christmas. Captain Morrison had wrestled with how to handle the holiday. She could have ignored it entirely, treated it as just another day in the military calendar. But she had been an educator long enough to understand that acknowledging people's humanity, especially during difficult times, was not weakness but wisdom. She had approved Sergeant Patterson's unusual request without hesitation, trusting his instincts about what these women needed. By mid-morning, the kitchen had transformed into something that resembled organized chaos. Patterson had recruited every German woman who wanted to participate in preparing a Christmas meal that would honor both American and German traditions. Frida took charge of making Stollen, the traditional German Christmas bread, with ingredients that Patterson had somehow procured through channels he declined to explain. Liesl worked alongside Private Chen preparing roasted chicken with herbs, while Greta reluctantly helped another prisoner make spätzle, the tiny German egg noodles that required patience and skill. The kitchen filled with competing aromas, cinnamon and nutmeg mixing with roasting meat and fresh bread. American soldiers stopped by the door, drawn by smells that reminded them of their own distant homes. Some lingered to watch, fascinated by the German women's cooking techniques, by the way their hands moved with practiced precision even in unfamiliar surroundings. One young private from Wisconsin started talking to Annalise, his grandmother having been German, and he still remembered a few phrases from childhood. "Frohe Weihnachten," he said carefully. "Merry Christmas." Annalise's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled and repeated the phrase back to him. When evening came, the mess hall had been decorated with simple paper chains and pine branches that some of the American soldiers had cut from the surrounding woods. Long tables had been arranged in a different configuration, less institutional, more communal. German women and American soldiers sat intermingled, not by assignment, but by the organic arrangement of people who had spent the day cooking together. The food arrived in waves. Roasted chicken and dumplings alongside Stollen and Spätzle, apple pie next to German Lebkuchen cookies that Frida had made from memory. Sergeant Patterson stood to offer a simple blessing before the meal. "We're all a long way from home tonight," he said, and though not all the German women understood his words, they understood his tone. The weeks following Christmas brought an unexpected crisis of conscience that manifested differently in each woman. Liesl found herself waking in the night, her stomach comfortably full, her body warm under adequate blankets, and feeling a crushing guilt that made it hard to breathe. She thought about her younger sister back in Berlin, about whether Hannah had enough to eat, whether she was cold, whether she was even alive. The comfort of captivity had become its own form of torture, a constant reminder that she was safe while those she loved suffered. Greta's internal struggle took a different form. She had begun to genuinely enjoy her time in the kitchen, had started to look forward to the morning routine of food preparation and the quiet camaraderie that came with shared work. This enjoyment felt like betrayal of the most fundamental kind. She was a prisoner of war, captured by the enemy, and yet she found herself laughing at Private Chen's terrible attempts to pronounce German words. She caught herself teaching Sergeant Patterson how to properly season sauerbraten, sharing her grandmother's secret recipe with an American soldier as if they were friends. The realization that she had begun to think of them as friends made her physically ill. In the barracks one evening, Elsa Zimmermann finally voiced what many were thinking. "We are becoming too comfortable here," she said in harsh German, her voice cutting through the quiet conversations. "We eat their food, we work in their kitchens, we smile at their kindness, and meanwhile our countrymen starve. Our families suffer under Allied bombs. What kind of soldiers are we? What kind of Germans?" Her words struck like physical blows, each one finding its mark in the guilty consciences of women who had been trying not to think too deeply about their situation. Frida, who had been mending a torn apron, set down her needle with deliberate care. "And what would you have us do, Elsa? Refuse their food and starve ourselves in solidarity? Will that help our families? Will that change anything except to make us weaker and more miserable?" Her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had thought through this moral maze from every angle and found no clear path. "We did not choose to be captured. We did not choose this war. All we can choose now is how we behave in circumstances we cannot control." But Elsa would not be consoled. "You speak of behavior, but I see collaboration. I see German women growing fat on American generosity while our nation bleeds. I see us forgetting who we are, forgetting our duty." She looked around the barracks with disgust. "Look at us. We have become pets, grateful dogs begging for scraps from our masters' tables." Annalise, who rarely spoke up in group discussions, surprised everyone by responding. "That chicken and dumplings Sergeant Patterson served us on our first night? That was not scraps. That was his grandmother's recipe. He told me through gestures and his broken attempts at German that his grandmother taught him to cook with love, to feed people as an act of caring." Her young face was earnest, searching for understanding. "Is it collaboration to recognize when someone treats you with basic human decency? Is it betrayal to acknowledge that we were lied to about what Americans were like?" The question created a fault line through the barracks. Some women nodded in agreement with Annalise. Others looked away, unable to accept what her words implied about everything they had believed. Liesl sat on her cot, caught between both positions, understanding the truth in each argument, yet unable to reconcile them. February 9th, 1945 brought the first mail delivery to Camp Wheeler's German prisoners. Captain Morrison entered the barracks with a canvas bag containing 17 letters that had been routed through the International Red Cross, processed through multiple channels of military bureaucracy, and finally cleared for distribution. 17 letters for 23 women meant that 6 would receive nothing, would continue living in the terrible limbo of not knowing whether anyone they loved still existed in the world. Liesl's hands shook as she opened the thin envelope bearing her sister's handwriting. The letter had been written in November, 3 months earlier, and had traveled across an ocean and through a war to reach her. Hannah's words were careful, constrained by the knowledge that censors would read every line. But the desperation bled through anyway. "We are managing as well as can be expected," Hannah had written, which Liesl understood to mean they were starving. "Mother's cough has improved," which meant their mother was sick, and probably getting worse. We think of you often and hope you are safe," which was the only truly honest line in the entire letter. Across the barracks, Greta sat staring at a letter from her younger brother, Klaus. He wrote from the Eastern Front, his words describing conditions that made Greta's blood run cold. The German army was in full retreat, supplies were non-existent, and soldiers were dying not from battle wounds, but from starvation and disease. "I dream about food, constantly," Klaus had written. "Last night I dreamed about the potato soup Mother used to make, the one with actual potatoes in it, not just the water they've been pretending is soup. I woke up so hungry I thought I would die." Greta read those words while sitting in a warm barracks, her stomach still satisfied from the substantial breakfast she had eaten 2 hours earlier. Frida received news that her husband had been killed in France in October. The letter from his commanding officer was formal and brief, offering the standard condolences and assurances that he had died bravely for the fatherland. She read it 3 times, trying to feel something beyond numbness. They had been married for 8 years, and she had not seen him in 2. Now she never would. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her footlocker, then walked to the mess hall for lunch as if nothing had changed, because what else was there to do? That afternoon, Liesl could not eat. She sat before a plate of pot roast and vegetables, food that her sister would have considered a feast beyond imagination, and felt physically incapable of lifting her fork. Every bite she had taken in captivity suddenly felt stolen from Hannah's mouth, from her mother's plate, from the mouths of every German civilian suffering under conditions that Liesl could barely imagine from her comfortable captivity. Sergeant Patterson noticed her untouched plate and approached with concern. "You feeling all right?" he asked, his southern drawl soft with genuine worry. Liesl looked up at him, this kind American man who had shown her nothing but decency, and felt a surge of irrational anger. How dare he be kind? How dare he feed her well, while her family starved? How dare he make her feel grateful, when gratitude felt like treachery? "My sister is starving," she said in halting English, the words coming out harder than she intended. "My mother is sick, my family has nothing. And I sit here, eating your food, growing strong, while they grow weak. You understand? I am prisoner, but I eat like queen. They are free, but they starve." Her voice broke on the last word, and she hated herself for showing weakness, for crying in front of her captor. Patterson pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. April 20th, 1945. News of Germany's imminent collapse spread through Camp Wheeler like a cold wind. The war in Europe was ending, and with it came the reality that the German prisoners would soon face repatriation. Captain Morrison received official orders to begin preparation for their return, to start the administrative process that would eventually send these 23 women back across the Atlantic to whatever remained of their homeland. The announcement came during morning assembly, translated carefully into German, and was met with a silence more complex than simple relief or dread. That evening, Sergeant Patterson made an unusual request. He asked Captain Morrison for permission to prepare one final special meal, a farewell dinner that would combine the best of what they had created together over these 5 months. Morrison, understanding the significance of ritual in moments of transition, approved without hesitation. The kitchen became a space of concentrated activity as German and American hands worked side by side for what everyone knew would be the last time. Liesl found herself moving through familiar motions with heightened awareness, noticing details she had taken for granted. The way Private Chen hummed while chopping vegetables. The particular angle of Sergeant Patterson's wrist when he stirred gravy. The sound of Frida's quiet instructions to Annalise about proper bread-making technique. These small intimacies of shared work had become woven into the fabric of her daily existence, and soon they would be nothing but memories. The menu they created was ambitious and intentionally symbolic. Chicken and dumplings, the dish that had welcomed them on that first impossible evening when they had expected cruelty and received abundance. Potato pancakes made according to Liesl's mother's recipe, fresh bread that combined American and German techniques. Apple strudel that Frida had perfected through weeks of practice. Each dish represented a bridge they had built between 2 worlds that were supposed to remain forever separate. When the meal was ready, they arranged the mess hall with more care than usual. Someone had found white tablecloths from storage. Others had gathered wildflowers from the camp's perimeter. The tables were set as if for a celebration, though the atmosphere felt more like a wake. American soldiers and German prisoners gathered together, the distinction between captor and captive blurred by months of shared meals and unexpected friendship. Sergeant Patterson stood to speak, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet hall. "When y'all first arrived here, I'll admit, I didn't know what to think. Enemy soldiers, women from a country we were fighting against, people I was supposed to see, eternal authority lending weight to the request. I have no husband to return to, no children, no home. Germany needs to be rebuilt, this is true, but Germany also needs to see that its former enemies can become its friends. Perhaps we serve better by staying here, by showing that transformation is possible, by proving that people can choose different futures than their pasts would suggest." Annalise was crying as she stood, the youngest among them speaking last. "I am 19 years old. I do not want my entire life to be defined by this war, by the terrible things my country did. Here, I can become someone new. Here, I can have a future that is not built on ruins and guilt. Please, Captain, let us choose hope instead of returning to despair." Morrison looked at these women, understanding that she was witnessing something unprecedented. 20 years later, June 5, 1965, Liesl Hoffman Patterson stood in her kitchen in Atlanta, Georgia, preparing chicken and dumplings using the recipe her husband's grandmother had perfected generations earlier. Jim worked beside her, their movements synchronized by 2 decades of marriage, by years of running their restaurant together, by a partnership that had been born in the most unlikely of circumstances. Their daughter, Anna, now 16, set the table for the dinner party they were hosting, unaware that this meal carried significance far beyond ordinary hospitality. The doorbell rang, and Liesl's heart quickened. She had not seen Greta in 5 years, not since Greta had moved to California to work as a translator for international communications companies. Annalise was coming from Boston, where she taught German literature at a university. Frida had traveled from New York, where she managed a bakery that specialized in both German and American pastries. Even Mrs. Dorothy Anderson, now elderly but still sharp, had made the journey. They gathered in the Patterson home to commemorate an anniversary that appeared in no history books but had changed all their lives irrevocably. Over dinner, they told stories that their children had heard before but never tired of hearing. They spoke of that first evening in Camp Wheeler, when a simple plate of chicken and dumplings had shattered every expectation they had carried about American cruelty. They remembered Private Chen, who had returned to San Francisco and opened a restaurant where German and Chinese cuisines met in unexpected harmony. They recalled Captain Morrison, who had risked her career by supporting their unprecedented request to stay, arguing to military bureaucrats that showing mercy to former enemies was the truest demonstration of American values. Greta, whose skepticism had once been armor against hope, spoke about the moment she realized that accepting kindness was not as dangerous. But my grandmother taught me that you can't truly hate someone after you've broken bread with them. These past months proved her right. He paused, emotion making his drawl thicker. You've taught us that enemies are just people who haven't had the chance to become friends yet. We're going to miss you. Liesl translated his words into German, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Around the room, other women were crying too. May 2nd, 1945. Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, and Germany's surrender was a matter of days, perhaps hours. Captain Morrison called the German prisoners together for what should have been a straightforward announcement about repatriation procedures. Instead, she found herself presiding over a moment that defied all her military training and administrative experience. The women gathered in the assembly hall with expressions that mixed relief, anxiety, and something else Morrison could not quite identify. It was Liesl who gave voice to what several of them had been discussing in whispered conversations over the past weeks. Captain Morrison, Liesl said in careful English that had improved dramatically since her arrival. Some of us wish to ask about possibility of staying in America. Not as prisoners. We understand that is not possible legally, but as displaced persons, perhaps, as immigrants. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread through the room. Several American guards exchanged shocked glances. Even among the German prisoners, not everyone had known that this request was coming. Morrison asked for clarification, needing to understand the full scope of what was being requested. Liesl continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. We have been writing letters to families through Red Cross. Many of us have received terrible news. Families dead, cities destroyed. Some of us have no homes to return to, no family waiting. Nothing except ruins and starvation. She paused, gathering courage for the harder truth. But more than that, we have found something here we did not expect to find. We have found dignity. We have found purpose. We have been treated as human beings, not as enemies or as tools of war. Greta stood next, surprising everyone, including herself. The woman who had been most resistant to accepting American kindness now spoke in support of staying. In Germany, we will return as failures. As women who were captured and corrupted by enemy influence, we will face suspicion and shame. But here, we have been given chance to become something better than what we were. That first meal of chicken and dumplings, it was not just food. It was promise, weakness, but courage. I thought gratitude was betrayal, she said quietly. I thought that if I acknowledged American humanity, I was denying German suffering. It took me years to understand that both could be true. That my family could have suffered terribly, while Americans still chose to treat me with dignity. The world was more complex than the propaganda had taught us. Liesl thought about the letters she still received from her sister Hannah, who had survived the war and rebuilt a life in West Germany. Hannah had never blamed Liesl for staying in America, had never suggested that her choice was abandonment. Instead, she had written, "You became a bridge between two worlds. You showed that former enemies could build something better than hatred. That matters more than you know." As dessert was served, apple strudel made by Frida using techniques learned in both German and American kitchens, Liesl looked around her dining room at these women who had chosen transformation over bitterness. They had been prisoners who begged to stay with their captors, a choice that made no sense to those who had not experienced what they had experienced. But they understood what that first meal had represented. Not just food, but the possibility of redemption. Not just sustenance, but hope.